So now we use the grid on our page. That's very useful. But one thing can be noticed on the main page. Now here, above the image, we got this white space. So the image is now not positioned correctly anymore. Now the reason for this is simple. If we inspect the main element and the rules of it, we see that we got a margin top there. We should remove that to ensure that the image looks good again. So let's go back to our shared CSS file. Let's remove that margin top here along with our min-height calculation. We don't need it anymore because now we use the solution of reserving the place for the header with an extra row. So now if we reload, this change stays in place. On the other pages, we didn't have a problem with that anyways. And now it's fixed on this page and all the other pages too. Now if you go into mobile mode, you also might notice that the footer doesn't really sit at the very bottom of this entire thing. In the layout tab, you can still see that we have a grid though, and the grid row doesn't go to the very bottom. So that's the issue we got here. We can also see that our footer here is basically cut off. Now, the problem is the footer increases in size on a mobile device because we use Flexbox to position the elements in the footer below each other, like terms of use, which are outside of the footer box here. So we basically need to change our setup here for the grid to something else than these fixed 8 rems. This should be something else which allows the footer to also grow. Something like auto maybe. However, if we add auto, it still isn't perfect here, as you can tell. And besides that, if we set this to auto, we got a different layout on the other pages too. Because if we got auto twice, as we now have, these two will basically distribute empty space between each other. And this is not the layout we want to have. So auto isn't really the solution we're looking for here. Instead, there is a special function which I haven't shown you yet. It's fit-content. Fit content takes an argument which is a default size you can assign, like 8 rem, which will be used in case the content is smaller or requires less space than that. If the content requires more space than that, it will get this size though, but only as much as needed by the content. So if we set this and I now reload, now the footer is at the bottom. By the way, in Firefox, you can still scroll, as you can scroll to the right, but this is actually just a bug. It doesn't work like this if you open it on a mobile device or if you preview it in Chrome, for example. There, everything works as it should, and the same is true for all the other pages. So now everything should look quite nice and should work the way, well, we expect it to work. The footer is at the bottom and takes as much space as required in case it's not smaller than the 8 rem, which would be the default size of the footer otherwise. So I hope this also helps with styling this and understanding how you can style it. Fit content is another very useful value when it comes to having some row which should have some minimum size but also not be bigger than its content. This is what you're looking for. Now that we worked on our page quite a bit, let's go back to some theory in quotation marks, because we'll of course still stay in a web project and move things around. And let's learn how we can actually position the elements in a grid in case we're not happy with the default positioning. So back in our project, right now we have a certain positioning of the elements in a grid that we never questioned. They're always taking the full size of their cell, both on the horizontal and the vertical axis. They always stretch the full cell. And that, of course, may be the behavior you want. But sometimes it's not what you want. And you got a couple of properties that help you with positioning elements in the grid. You add them on the grid container, so on the container class selector in our case here. The first one is justify items. If you set this to central, let's see what happens. Let's reload. And now what we can see, if we turn on that grid inspection again, is that in our grid cells, or the grid tracks actually, so the areas where a certain element is positioned in, like the green element here, actually has the first row, don't forget. Now it's positioned in the center of that area. So the green element is in the center of its row. The red element is in the center of its 2 cells here where it's assigned to. And the yellow element is just in the center of its cell. The blue element again is in the center of its entire track. So this is now what justify items does. It positions the elements in their grid tracks, so in their areas, so to say. We also can assign a value of start there. Now this moves them to the start of their respective track. So green and blue are at the start of their rows. Red is at the start of its area. And yellow is at the start of its cell, since it's only assigned to a single cell. And we also got end, of course, which moves them to the end. And important, start and end does not mean left and right. It means start and end depending on the read direction of the browser the users use. So if someone is accessing the page with settings set to right to left reading, well then start will actually be on the right instead of on the left. That's just a little side note. So this is justify items. Now the default is stretch. So you don't need to set this. This is the default behavior you saw at the beginning. Now, this was the positioning within their rows, so to say. Now, if you want to position them within their columns, you got align items. Now, this can also be set to center, for example. If you set align items to center and you reload, now the elements are vertically centered in their tracks, so in their columns, basically. And of course here, you also got start as an option. Start moves them to the start of their row or of their area. And you got end too. End will, of course, simply move them to the very end of their row. And now you might already have guessed it. The default here also is stretch. You don't need to set this. This is what you started with. Now we had a look at the positioning of the grid elements. Sometimes you also want to position the entire grid. And with that, I don't mean the container. You can, of course, position that differently. For example, by using position absolute and moving it somewhere, by putting it into a flex box, by putting it into another grid. This is also possible. But I mean that the grid might have a certain height, which is not filled by all its rows and columns. So height and width, actually, which is not filled. Let me demonstrate this. I'll add a width of 500 pixels here. And now let's remove all the auto assignments. Let's also shrink the column sizes to 20% so that it doesn't add up to 100. So there will be some empty space. And on this row value here, we're not going to use auto, but the maximum value for that row, let's say, is actually 20 rem. Now, with that all set, let's maybe also increase that a bit more to 800 height and width. Let's save that and reload. And now we got a grid container, as you can see, which is bigger than its content. Now the question is, where do you want to position the entire content? So I don't mean the elements in their tracks or in their areas. I mean the entire grid content. Now for this, you got 2 additional properties, and the first one is justify content. This positions the entire grid on the x-axis. You can put this or set this to center, for example. If you reload, you see the grid is now centered in the container area. You also have start, which is the default as you saw, and end, which unsurprisingly moves it to the end of its container area. You also can assign stretch here, which actually leads to the same result as start though. So this does not stretch the values because it doesn't override the row and column sizes you defined in your template settings here. Now this is the positioning along the x-axis. Let's maybe set this back to center. Now we can also position it on the y-axis, of course. And for this, we got align content. So you probably see a pattern. Justify at the beginning means x-axis or within a row. Align at the beginning means y-axis or along the columns. And here, of course, you got the usual suspects. You can set align content to center. And if you do that and you reload, now the grid is centered vertically in its container. And of course, you also got start and end as alternatives. So start is basically the default you started with, and end will move it, well, to the end of its container. Now this can be highly useful in cases where you simply have a grid which might not necessarily fill the entire space you reserved for it, and where you want to ensure that it's still positioned in a certain way within that container. So justify content and align content are your friends then. Now we had a detailed look at how you can position the grid and the grid cells. Now, sometimes you want to position one element in a certain way that differs from the other elements. So for example here, all the elements, so now I'm talking about the items in the grid again, all the elements are set to stretch both on the x and the y axis. Now what if you actually wanted to set element 2, so the red one, to be centered both horizontally and vertically in its box? Well, you can override the positioning for a single element by going to that element's selector. So I'm talking about the red one, element 2. So it's the L2 selector. And there you can set justify self. Justify self positions it on the x-axis. So we could set this to center here. And now if we go back and reload, you see now it's not stretching on the x-axis anymore. And of course, therefore, we also have align self to position on the y-axis. We can set this to center too. And now all the other elements still have the stretch setting, which is set by the parent, by the container. But this element 2 overrides it for this element only, because there we assign justify and align self. And this is also very useful to know, and something which can be helpful with, well, your next project where you might not want to position all elements in the grid equally. Now with all that time spent on the grid and its many properties, let me compare the grid to Flexbox. When should you use which? Let's first of all understand the key difference between the CSS grid and CSS Flexbox. The grid is all about two-dimensional positioning. You have rows and columns. That's what it's all about. That is what we used all the time. Flexbox is one-dimensional. In Flexbox, you don't have rows and columns. Sure, you can use flex wrap to wrap items if your viewport is too small, for example. But in the end, you always just have flex direction row or column, and you either position them horizontally or vertically. So Flexbox is always a decent choice if you just have a row or a column of items. You can use flex wrap to still ensure that your row of items wraps itself in case that your viewport is becoming too small. But then you still might have the issue that the positioning of the items to each other is a bit harder in Flexbox than with the grid. And the grid is especially a great choice if you have a real layout with multiple dimensions, or for example with the form in our course project, where you want to position items next to each other in like, well, a grid. We can actually see this really well in our project. The form here is a grid because the way we position elements here would be impossible with Flexbox basically. The entire layout could have been done with Flexbox, but it's also done neatly with the grid, and it ensures that the footer is at the bottom. The fact that we can scroll here, again, is a bug stemming from Firefox. On the main page, we use the grid too for the layout, but for example, for the plans, we use Flexbox because it's just a row of items, 3 items next to each other. And Flexbox is awesome for situations like this. The same is true for our key features. It's one-dimensional. They're next to each other or below each other, just as our plans. So no need to use the grid here. You can do that, it's not necessarily wrong, but Flexbox is made for situations like this. So I hope this helps you. One dimension, normally you should take Flexbox. Multiple dimensions, the grid is something you should think about. Now where should you go from this point on? I can only recommend that you practice, practice, and practice the grid. In the last lecture of this module, you'll find useful links for the grid, like the Mozilla Development article series on it. And this is a great way for you to dive deeper, to read all about the grid. So in case you want to dive deeper into some concept, this might be easier than watching all the videos again, so the videos combined with this article will especially be a great combination. And there you also find plenty of examples with which you can easily play around, besides the examples in this course. The best thing to master the grid, however, is to simply start building layouts and whatever you want to build with the grid. Set yourself challenges, rebuild certain layouts you see on other web pages, try to position elements in a different way, and dive into the documentation if you're getting stuck. This is how you can learn it all. The grid can look super intimidating because it has so many different properties and ways of achieving certain looks. The important thing for you is there's more than one way to achieve a certain result, and definitely play around with them to get a feeling for which one works best for you. There's not much you can do wrong here. There are a lot of possibilities to achieve one and the same thing, but this also means it's fine if you found one way that works for you. So with that, I hope this was helpful, and we'll move on with this course. So in this module, we learned quite a bit about the grid. Time to summarize it. You learned how you can create a grid. You do that by adding the display grid property to an element. This will automatically create a grid then, and it will automatically place the direct child elements in rows of that grid. The rows are generated automatically and are as high as the content requires it to be. You can override that default with grid autoflow. You can set the default of creating rows to create columns there, for example. And you can also style these automatically generated rows or columns with grid auto rows or grid auto columns. With grid auto gap, you can also add gaps between your columns and rows to the grid. Now that's the general grid. Regarding the structure of the grid, you define columns and or rows explicitly, if you want to do this, via grid template columns or grid template rows. Now, please keep in mind what I said about the explicit and the implicit grid. You can also stick to these automatically generated rows if that is all you need. But if you need at least 2 columns or you need certain layouts for your rows, then you want to add your columns and rows manually with these 2 properties. You can configure both rows and columns with repeat. There you enter the amount of times you want to repeat a certain size, and then there will be as many columns or rows created as this function spits out. For example, repeat 10 rem would create 3 columns or rows which have a width or height of 10 rem. You can also use autofill or autofit on columns only though in the repeat function instead of entering a number in the times slot. This will then generate as many columns as fit into one row. Autofit also ensures that it's nicely centered and takes the full available width into account. And you shouldn't forget about the min-max function, which you could enter in the size slot of the repeat function or in any other place where a size is required. Min-max will take 2 arguments. The first argument defines the minimum amount of width or height the column or row should have, and the second argument defines the maximum. This is great for ensuring that certain columns or rows are never smaller than a certain size, but also never bigger than another option. Or use auto as a maximum size, then they will always take the remaining free space. With the grid and its structure defined, it's all about placing elements. Now, you don't need to define a grid structure on your own. You can just use the automatically created rows for that. But you can then, in either of the 2 cases, decide where an element should be by using grid row and or grid column. And then you can use line numbers or line names. Or you use grid area together with named areas. You also shouldn't forget about span X as well as negative values for line numbers. This can help you to ensure that your elements span a certain amount of cells or simply span an entire row or whatever your requirement is. And last but not least, you can not just position your elements in the grid, you can also align them. And alignment is done with justify items on the x-axis and align items on the y-axis. For the entire grid, where the content might not take the entire space you reserved, you can position it with justify content on the x-axis and align content on the y-axis. This is the brief summary. Obviously, it's all about practicing and diving into the different properties and simply using them, but I hope that this module was very helpful when it comes to getting started with the grid. Now that we took our first steps with the CSS grid, let's apply some of the concepts we learned about to our project before we dive even deeper into the grid and into some other capabilities it offers to us. So how could we add it to our project? Later, I'll add it to this hosting page, to our form here, but one thing I want to do right now already on every page is I want to control the header, main area, and footer with the grid. Because if you have a look at our web page here, we got one basic layout which is the same on every page. We got our header, which is fixed of course, our main area, and the footer. And that is something we could definitely implement with the help of the CSS grid. So let's do that. And let's do it in the shared CSS file, because it is the case on every page. And there, I want to turn my body into a CSS grid, just as we did it previously in this module. I'll set display to grid here, and if I save that and I now reload on that packages page, not a lot changed, as you can see. The same is true on the main page here. So this is a grid though. We can verify this if we click on body on the layout tab in the Firefox Developer Tools. Here we can see it's a grid, and it is a grid with only 2 rows, with a big main row and that bottom row for the footer. Now you might wonder where our backdrop, modal, and the header and the navigation are. These are all child elements of the body after all, but it doesn't look like separate rows were created for them. Well, these are all elements that are positioned non-statically. So the backdrop has a position of fixed, the modal has a position of fixed, the header has a position of fixed, and the navigation has a display of none here. Now, if we have such elements, then this essentially leads to them not being part of the grid. If we shrink that and go to mobile view, then our navigation gets a position of fixed too. So this also is not a part of the grid on mobile view. And that is something important to realize. Elements which are not part of the document flow, so fixed and absolute elements, are not part of the grid and hence are not considered for the rows. And that is fine actually, because here we don't want them to be part of the grid. I want to control the rest with my grid. So our layout will actually not contain a header, because the header is detached from the document flow. It will just contain our main area and the footer. Now, one thing I want to do, which we can see on, for example, the customers or packages page if we're not zoomed in, is I want to control the placement of the footer with the help of the grid. Right now, we're doing this manually in our shared CSS file. Here in the main class, we got our min height set, and this works. But with the grid, we can actually follow a different approach. I can explicitly add 2 lines, so 2 rows I mean, with grid template rows. Now the first row will be our main area, and there I can set it to auto, and the footer has a height of 8 rem with all the things that are involved in it. So we can set the second row to 8 rem. Now let me remove or comment out the min height assignment here, and let's reload the page. Now what we can see is that the footer now is positioned differently. The grid, if we inspect it, still has this main area, but then the bottom row here does contain the footer, but somehow this doesn't look right? So for example, the main area goes beneath our header. Now the reason for that simply is that our header is fixed. Now here are 2 possible solutions. For one, we could add a padding top to our body element of 3.5 rem to push the content, well, below the header basically. Now if you inspect body, we can actually see that it is starting below our header. So this row starts below our header here. But still we see this doesn't seem to work. And the reason for this is the auto value for the first row. Auto simply takes as much space as required by the content. If we wanted to fill everything up, we would have to give our body a height of 100%, and the same for HTML to really make this work. So now if we add height 100% to both, now this works. The same on the customers page, because now we're basically saying that our grid takes the entire height of the page. It got a padding so that the content really starts only after the header. And then we got 2 rows, and the first row is auto, so it takes all the remaining space, and the remaining space is essentially 100% minus the row height for the footer. And the cool thing is, on the starting page, where we got more content in the first row, auto will also ensure that it doesn't crop this content. So here, it's not just the remaining space of 100% minus the footer. Instead, it is as much space as the content requires, and the footer is then added below that. So now we got a way more elegant solution for our problem of having a footer which should always be at the bottom, whilst at the same time ensuring that our main content has the place it needs. And again, for the header, it's important to understand, since it's a fixed header, it's not part of the document flow, and therefore it doesn't need its separate row in the grid. We could theoretically, though, also add a row here and remove padding top. So let me remove that here. And instead add a row with 3.5 rem for the header. Now this would basically destroy everything, because that first row would actually be occupied by our main content, and therefore, well, it looks ugly. But we, of course, can specifically tell the main content into which row it should go. So we can go to the main selector here and add grid row here. And basically, we want to start after the second row line. The first one is at the very top. The second one comes after the first row. So in line 2, we want to start. And then we want to go down to the third line. So we want to end before the third row line. Now if we reload, we're back to where we were, but now the footer jumps ahead. Well, we can also change that by simply giving the footer a clear place. So we can also take grid row down to our footer here. And in the main footer class, we simply tell it to start after line 3 and go to line 4. And now the footer is at the bottom, also for customers, for packages, excuse me, and also for the main page. And if we go to mobile view, this also looks all right to me. Yeah. So this is now a different solution. Now, of course, there's yet another way of solving this with template areas. In the body or on the body tag, we can add grid template areas. And of course, there we also can assign names to our columns and rows. Now, we only got one column, so we only need one value per string. But now we can replicate our 3-row setup here with 3 strings which are beneath each other. And then the first row would be the header. We can name it header or give it a dot to leave it empty, but let's name it header. Then we can name this main, and we can name this footer. And now this allows us to go to the main selector and now not select a place in the grid like this, but use grid area instead and target main here. And for the footer at the very bottom, of course, there we also don't use grid row like this, but grid area, and we target footer. So that's yet another way of solving this. And as you can see, this also does the trick and works just fine. With that, you saw a couple of ways of using the grid and positioning this. It's of course up to you which one you want to use. I believe that this is the easiest to grasp because you assign clear names to the different areas in your page. But in the end, it's up to you. And this is one example of how you can use the grid to solve a certain problem more elegantly. Let's have a look at how we use the CSS grid together with media queries. For that, back in the code, I'll remove justify and align content because I want to have the grid in the top left corner essentially. And I will also set element 2 back to take that stretch mode again. So now this is the grid again. Now, of course, we could translate this kind of to having a header, a footer, a sidebar, and a main area. Kind of what we had in assignments earlier. Now, this is one possible layout, but maybe in mobile mode, so once you decrease the size of the page, you want to set this to behave differently. Now, first of all, what I need to do is I need to get rid of that hard-coded width. it should again be flexible regarding this. But still, the issue I have here is it becomes very narrow, and there is a certain breakpoint where you probably want to ensure that element 2, let's say, takes the entire second row, and that there is a third row before the footer where the yellow element 1, can then go to. This would be a typical requirement for a grid-based web page, where you want to have a different positioning and maybe a different amount of rows even for different layouts. On a desktop device, 3 rows is fine. On a mobile device, we probably need 4. Now, of course, we can implement this with the help of media queries, and I will add the media queries directly after the element they are used on, just to keep this easier to see. So let's add a media query right after the container, because we'll need to add a third row. So here I'll set this to max width actually, so this is not mobile first here, excuse me, but I thought it was easier to focus on the grid on a bigger screen. So now we'll engineer a solution for the smaller screens with max width. And let's say the max width we want to have a look at is 40 rem. So for screens up to 40 rem, I want to have a different grid. And that different grid needs an additional row, a row for the yellow element. Now we can simply copy grid template areas and grid template rows. Whoops, not into the media query like this though, but into the container selector in there. Let's get rid of that comment and grid gap. And now we need to add an additional row by overwriting grid template rows and by simply adding an additional row then. We got a third row with 100 pixels. Now let's say we want to have 150 maybe there. And I then want to add a fourth row. So I'll name this row for start here maybe, and then add my 100 pixel row there, row for end thereafter. So this is now the updated row setup with an extra row. Now in the template areas, I also want to add it. And I want to say main actually takes the entire third row on mobile devices. And as I just said, we have a new row below that, above the footer, which would be our, let's name it, side bar, so to say, now pushed into its own row, occupying the full row, let's say. Of course, you could also add some dots if you don't want this to be the case. Now with this, we added a new row and we changed the positioning with the help of template areas. And the cool thing is, since we are referencing these areas on our elements, at least for most of them, we don't even need to change them. And we need to change element 1 because here I'm still using that line-based approach. And the easiest way to make this really flexible is to also use grid area there and assign a name of side. And let's now also add this instead of the dots here. First one should stay a dot, but here let's say on our desktop layout. And now we never need to touch the elements because they always refer to the same name. We just restructure our amount and positioning of cells with grid template rows and grid template areas, and if we were to need it, with grid template columns, of course. And now we can save this and reload, and we get the same layout as before, but if I shrink the screen, it then goes into that mobile mode. And that's the cool thing about media queries and the grid. It's really easy to build highly flexible and responsive layouts with media queries just as you learned it, but by taking advantage of features like this, named areas, and the advantage that you never have to change your elements again, you just change the general layout you define on the grid container. This is something I want you to take with you, that you think about the grid like this, that you take it as a chance to really configure everything on the container, adjust it with media queries as required, and then save a lot of work because you don't need to reposition anything else. And of course, you're free to override whatever needs to be overwritten on the container. So if you also want to change the item positioning, you could override justify items and so on here too. Now that we talked a lot about the general capabilities of the grid and especially about how you can position things in the grid, let's talk about the automatic capabilities of the grid. We already saw them partly in action now want to dive deeper. Attached to this video, you'll find yet another little theory starting project. If you open and run it, it looks like this. Well, like this without the grid preview. So it's a collection of quotes. You might identify which quote is by me and which quotes are by other famous people. So this is our collection of quotes, and it's, well, basically distributed there or handled by a grid. The grid still is on the container glass here with display grid. And the only thing I did when it comes to laying the grid out and styling it is I defined columns, 2 columns of equal size. Of course, I could have used repeat to 15 rem instead of manually setting this. So this is an alternative. This is not what it's about though. So this only creates 2 columns. But as you can clearly see here on the page, we got more than 1 row or no row, because I didn't define any rows, but actually you see we got 4 rows. You can see it really well in the preview here in the bottom corner. Now the reason for the existence of these rows is that by default, as I already explained at the beginning of this module, if you add display grid to any element, it will put all its child elements, its direct child elements, into new rows. It will create new rows dynamically. This, of course, is a good behavior because it ensures that we can create dynamic grids. So if we happen to have a page where we don't know how many rows we need, for example, because the user can create them with the help of some JavaScript function that adds elements to the DOM, anything like that. So whenever we don't know how many rows we need, we can rely on the grid automatically creating them. However, thus far, we didn't really have a look at how we can control the size of these rows, for example. As it looks, the default size is auto, because each cell here essentially is just as big as its content requires it to be, or its neighbor column here, as in the case of this element here. The content wouldn't require it to have such a big cell, but of course the neighbor element has the requirement of having such a big cell, and since it's in the same row, the row height is adjusted and the other element also gets the same row height. But we can of course override this default. We can add grid auto rows here as a property. This allows us to create the style of automatically generated rows. The default here is auto, which means the size will be auto. We can override the size, for example, to 30 rem. If I do that and I reload, now you see we got very, very huge cells, because now every newly generated row does not orientate itself on the content it holds, but it simply has a height of 30 rem. Now this is a bit too big maybe, so let's set this back to 11 or 12 rem maybe. Let's save this. Now we got some nicer items here. Now obviously auto might have not been a bad setting here, but if you want to ensure that all rows are equally sized, then being able to set a clearly defined height here is certainly a nice tool. And of course you can also use min-max here, for example, to define a minimum height of 8 rem, but auto otherwise. Now they would not be equally sized, but they also wouldn't be as small as they were before. So this might also be a look you're interested in. The main takeaway here is that grid auto rows allows you to define the size of the newly added rows, something we weren't able to do previously. Now that we had a look at grid auto rows, let's also have a look at how we can automatically add columns. Right now, the default behavior is that new content automatically is put in a new row. This is not the worst default behavior, because especially if we consider that we're most of the time designing for mobile phones first, adding content at the bottom is typically a better idea than adding it to the right. But you can switch that behavior nonetheless. You can tell the grid to not add new items as a new row, but to instead append new columns. You do this by adding the grid auto flow property. You might have guessed that grid auto columns is the right one, but this actually will be required to set the size of these automatically added columns. Grid auto flow allows you to define where new elements should be added, as a row, which is the default, which is why we didn't set it previously, or as a column, which is the value I'm now setting. With this set to column, if we reload, you see now all the content is added to the right, which clearly doesn't lead to the best design we ever had. But it is a possible approach you can take in case you want to ensure that you never add new rows, but always new columns as you add more and more elements. Be aware, you can still manually create rows with grid template rows, of course. This is something that's never affected. You can always explicitly add columns and rows. We're just talking about the automatically added ones, so for cases where you didn't define them yourself. So this is grid auto flow, and for completeness sake, of course you got grid auto columns then. If grid auto flow is set to column, then you obviously also want to give these newly added columns a style, and that would be, well, the width of these columns, so maybe 5 rem. If you set it to this, now it's really ugly, but this is something you can do. And again, this will of course be overwritten for your explicitly set columns. So the widths you assign here, of course, take precedence over the auto columns. Now with all of these properties set here, grid auto rows, flow, and columns, you now got a lot of controls to customize the behavior of the grid when it comes to automatically added items. Now I'll set auto flow back to row because it looks better, but it's important to keep in mind that you can change it if you need to change it. We had a look at grid auto flow, rows, and columns in the last lecture. Now, we also have a grid where we do define parts of the grid manually. We do define 2 columns. Of course, you can also define rows with grid template rows as you learned it. You could define, for example, the first column. You could say the first row. You could say the first row should maybe have a size of, let's say, 20 rem. If you do that and you reload, then obviously the first child element will be put into that first row because the grid is always populated according to the browser settings. So for left to right languages, it's populated from top to bottom and from left to right. For other right to left languages, the opposite is the case. So the grid automatically populates its cells with the child elements, and obviously the first child element goes into the first row. Now the interesting thing I here really want to emphasize is that we define 2 columns and 1 row manually. Of course we have more than just 1 child, however. We got a bunch of childs, a bunch of quotes. And all the other quotes which don't fit into the predefined row and the 2 columns are then put into these automatically added cells. The cells on the other end are added automatically because, as you learned, the grid automatically adds new rows. And each of the new rows still has the 2 manually defined columns. So I hope this makes sense. It's really important to understand that you can consider, or that you can think of the grid as an implicit and an explicit grid. The explicit grid is always the part you define with grid template columns and grid template rows. And sometimes you define the entire grid, like in our project where you defined header, main, and footer. That was everything we have on the page. But sometimes you only define parts of the grid or nothing at all. And the parts you didn't define explicitly are then managed with the implicit grid, which you can in turn control with the grid auto settings here. So I hope this makes sense. I'm really emphasizing this because it is important to keep in mind how the grid works and that you can rely on parts or on new rows by default being added automatically. Enough about implicit and explicit grid. You learned how you can control the add new row or column behavior. Sometimes you want to have a layout where the child elements are put into cells in a row until they reach the edge of the current viewport, at which point they should jump into a new row and do the same again. Now here we don't have that behavior. If we shrink it, we reach a point where nothing happens, we just crop the content. We never have our content jump into a new line. And on the other hand, if we increase the width, it also doesn't populate this newly freed up space up here. It always stays the way it is. Now we can change this by dynamically generating columns. You could think that grid autoflow column would be the solution, but it actually isn't, because this will always put new content into a column. It doesn't check if the column still fits into the current viewport or not. However, we can create columns on our own here. The downside is that we need to know how many columns we need, and we don't know. Now we could try figuring this out with a couple of media queries and then simply override this property and change the amount of columns we create. But there's a convenient helper value we can enter, autofill. Now let me reduce the size to maybe 10 rem. And what autofill will do is it will ensure that it fills the current row with as many items as possible. And then it will wrap and enter a new row, basically. So if I save this and reload, you can see the effect here. We got 4 items in the first row now. If I increase the viewport, these become 5. And if I shrink it, well, then they jump into new lines. Well, of course, this is only possible to a certain extent, but this gives us a lot of flexibility already. So this can be really useful to create a truly dynamic grid for cases where you want to have multiple items sit next to each other. Now, if you want to restrict the maximum amount of items that are in a row, you can simply assign a max width to your container, which holds the grid in the end. There also is an alternative to autofill, and you can only see it if you got less items. So let me temporarily comment out the last 3 quotes so that we only have 3 quotes for now. Now you see the items are obviously not enough to fill the entire line or the entire row because we only have 3 items. But now we can use an alternative value, so not autofill, but autofit. Autofit will behave almost equal to autofill, but if I reload with autofit, you see it also centers this automatically. It will still, however, put this into a new line if the space is not enough. So autofit is a nice alternative to autofill for cases where you might end up with a layout where you don't have enough items for an entire row. So autofit and autofill are 2 great values you can use to make sure that your content is really using the available space in the best possible way. So now I'm going to comment in the other quotes here again. And with that, we're back to the last behavior we saw with autofill. Now we're almost done with the grid. There's one more thing which can come in handy though. If we go back to our main CSS file, let's position one element slightly different. Please note that the featured quote, which is this quote here, takes 2 columns as a width, so it spans 2 columns, I should say. Now let's move the quote, which we select with nth of type, so to select the second element with the quote class essentially, which is the first element after the featured quote. So we're selecting this quote now. And if I dare set grid column to span 2 to also turn this into a wider element, and I set autofill here to 3 instead, so to have 3 columns of 10 rem. If we now reload, we can see something interesting. The top right element here, the top right cell, is not occupied. There's no value, no element in it. The reason for this is that this normally would be the place of this second element here, the quote where we just increased it to span 2 columns. Now, the other quotes after it don't jump into that empty space because the DOM order is respected here. Unless we position an element explicitly with grid row and column. So if we were to position that element where we just changed the width basically, if we were to position this specifically in a certain position by assigning line names or numbers or an area, if we were to do that, then the element after it would actually take the empty space. But if we don't do this, if we only increase this to span more than 1 cell, then the cell which it would have normally gotten will stay empty. You can override this behavior by going back to grid autoflow, the property on the grid container, and by adding dense here. This is also available for a column, so if you're setting autoflow to column, column dense also exists. What dense does is it will override this default behavior of not taking the free space here, and if you therefore reload, now you see there is a quote in that space. And that is not the quote which would have normally gotten that space. One important note about this behavior though. You can use it to densely organize your grid and to ensure that there are no empty spaces, but please be aware that this may not be optimal. You can run into accessibility errors here because screen readers will read your page from top to bottom. So the DOM order is what they respect, and they will read items as they appear in the DOM. If you change the visuals to move them around, the thing people with screen readers will get out of your page is different to what other people can get out of your page. So this is something to keep in mind. Changing the order visually only is not always recommended. It is something you should do with great care. It is possible though, if your requirement is to not leave any empty spaces and if you want to ensure that therefore your grid is as dense as possible. So we spent a lot of time on the grid. Time to again use it in our project and then to conclude this module. I want to use the grid on our form here, so on the start hosting form, because we can actually organize this form as a grid, and that's exactly what I want to do. What I want to do precisely is on bigger screens like this one, so on not mobile modes, I want to position my labels and the form inputs next to each other. On mobile screens, I essentially want to position them as they currently are positioned. Now, for that, I'll use the grid. And since we'll see more on the desktop view, I'll actually start with the desktop-related styles, but we will also adjust this to be working mobile first throughout this module, or throughout the next lectures to be precise. So, what can we do? One thing I want to do is, on my start hosting CSS file, the sign up form here, I'll turn this into a grid, display grid. This will be relevant, or this should be applied for both mobile and desktop views, so I don't need to put this into a media query. This also has one interesting implication. If we reload, nothing changes, because the elements, the child elements, are automatically put into the rows which are created automatically. You can see that we do have a grid here though, if you click on that. And the other interesting thing you can see here in the developer tools already is this page now actually has two grids. The body grid, which is the header, main area, and footer, and this form grid. And they are kind of nested into each other. The body holds the main element as one element, so this is added to one row of the body grid, and the main grid on the other hand holds the form grid, and that is absolutely fine. You can nest grids into each other just as you can add flex containers into a grid and the other way around. So we got a nested grid, so to say. It's still a regular grid on my form here, and this is essentially the look I want to have on a mobile phone, so we probably don't need to change that much about that. But let's work on the desktop mode now. What can we change there? For that, I'll go into my media query at the bottom, because that is where I'll need to change things. And I want to define two columns there for my form, because I want to position labels and inputs next to each other, as I just said. So we add two columns with grid template columns. And now the first column for the label maybe should be 10 rem, and the other one should be auto and just be as wide as required. If I now reload, now we have the elements sit next to each other. Now maybe this is a bit too small, so let's increase the width of the sign up form to 30 rem here. That looks better. So now we're already taking advantage of the grid, and you can see how super easy and simple this is. Now with the grid added, we can also change the way we put distance between these elements. Right now, we do this with margins. For example, on the button, we can get rid of that. And we can also get rid of the other margins we have. Like here on sign up form labels, inputs, and selects. With this, if I save this and reload, there's no distance between the elements. But you know how you can put distance between your rows? You add a grid gap. So we can add a grid row gap here of, let's say, 1 rem. If I reload, now there is some distance in between again. You could also add one between the columns, so a grid column gap, or the shorthand of course, of maybe 0.5 rem. Now we can also see there is a little bit of distance between the labels and the inputs. Now, if we want to ensure that the checkbox and its label are still closer next to each other, one thing we can simply do is go to the index.html file and scroll down to the checkbox. And here where we have the checkbox and our checkbox label, we can wrap this into a div where we assign a class of maybe sign up form checkbox. And now we put both elements into there. Now, if we save that, one problem we'll face is that it's squeezed into one cell and the button takes the cell next to it. Obviously, this is not the style we want, and we can easily change it by adding a class of sign-up-form checkbox. So this is the selector selecting the div we just added, and giving it a grid column of span 2, so that this actually takes 2 cells. If we now reload, this is again taking 2 cells, therefore the button is below it, and now we can see that this looks much nicer again. Now, one other thing I want to do real quick here, just to practice the grid a bit more, or maybe something for you to practice it, make sure that this dropdown actually goes in the second row, so that in the first row we just have the title label, second row should just be the dropdown, and thereafter you have the other form as it looks right now. Here's your chance to pause the video, thereafter we'll do this together. Were you successful? Let's try it out. So we want to put the label into one line and the dropdown into the line below it. Well, one easy way of doing that, of course, is that we simply select the dropdown element here and assign it a row explicitly instead of letting the grid auto-populate itself. We can select that dropdown here, so this select element, in a couple of different ways. For example, by using the select tag selector or by using the ID attribute selector. And I'll use that just to, again, practice this. So let's use our sign up form and in there select any element which has the ID attribute, which in this case should be title because it has an ID of title. So let's select this. This should give us access to the dropdown. And now I want to move that into row number 2, as I said. Now, obviously, we can do this by saying that we want to put it into a row which comes after line 2, and then span 1 is the default. We could also say up to row 3, but we can omit this. And now if we reload, this is there, but now the first name jumps into the cell which was previously occupied by the dropdown. And the reason for this is that we explicitly assigned a new cell to this dropdown, and as I said, this will then not lead to the DOM order being respected. Instead, the element after it takes its place, because this is kind of taken out of the document flow, you could say. Now, one way around this is that we simply, instead of giving it a clearly defined row, we tell it that it should span 2 cells on the columns. This will now ensure that this place it previously had is not taken, because this element is now not taken out of the document flow. It just is broader. And that's exactly the use case we practiced a few minutes ago in the theory project. Now we got this positioned in the way we want it positioned. Let's now check the mobile view. Now on the mobile view, this looks pretty good already, because if we go back to our sign up form here where we set display grid, this obviously leads to all the elements being put into some default rows. The only thing I want to do here is I want to set grid auto rows to maybe 2 rem. Now if we reload, all the rows are equally high, which is a bit nicer in my opinion. And maybe we also add a gap here, a grid row gap of 0.5 rem between the rows. So there's a little bit more distance between the rows. With that, we got a nice mobile mode in my opinion. This looks all right. And we got a nice, desktop mode. Now, one thing we can notice on very small devices, down there we have a little bit of an issue with the checkbox and the sign up button. This won't actually be an issue though, because I'm just zoomed in. So this would actually be a super small device and we shouldn't run into issues there. If you want to get rid of this too, if you want to support calculators, well, then you can simply decrease the font size of your labels and you'll be fine again. You can use a normal media query for that. So that's not a grid issue. And on any realistic device, this looks good anyways. So I'm happy with that. We did add the grid, and with that we reformatted the form. And this shows another use case of the grid. Besides generating a general page layout with header, footer, and so on, now we're using it for a form. Also a very nice way of using the grid.